Welcome to today's webinar on going without CPU patches on Oracle eBusiness Suite 11i. My name is Phil Ryman. I'm the Director of Business Development and Integrigy, and I'll be the moderator for this e-learning session. Speaker today is Stephen Coast. Steve is the Chief Technology Officer and founder of Integrigy Corporation, and he's been working with Oracle products since 1994 with responsibilities that include database administrator, technical architect, IT security auditor, and applications administrator. For the past 14 years, Steve has focused on the security and auditing aspects of the Oracle Business Suite and Oracle Database, and has written and presented on these topics at various national and regional conferences, including OEUG, IOUG, and the National Collaborative Conferences. Steve is recognized nationally for his vast security knowledge and expertise. So now I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thanks so much, Phil. Today we're going to talk about Oracle eBusiness Suite 11i and security patches, specifically when you're not applying security patches. So there's a number of organizations who are running 11i and for a number of reasons aren't applying security patches and may not be in the future. And so basically we're going to try to address what the risk is, and two, what can you do? What are some of the mitigating controls, and what are the things you need to be aware of when you're not running security patches, especially for a long period of time? So before we get started, a brief introduction about Integrigy for those of you not familiar with us. Integrigy was founded in 2002, and we specialize in Oracle eBusiness Suite and Oracle Database Security. We have a product side of our business that has two products, AppCenter and AppDefend, which help protect your eBusiness Suite environment. And then we do a number of services, on-site security assessments, design services. A lot of the presentation today will be based off what we've learned actually working with clients like you to say, okay, you've got eBusiness Suite, you're not applying your security patches, what can we do to put in place to actually help you mitigate some of that risk? So enough about Integrigy, let's talk about your Oracle eBusiness Suite 11i environment and security patches. So what we'll do is give you a little bit of overview about 11i and the critical patch updates, and then talk about the different layers. So there are CPU patches at the database for the eBusiness Suite and the application server, and we'll actually talk about each of those separately. What are some of the risks of those security patches? A brief background for those of you not familiar with an Oracle Critical Patch Update. Oracle does release security patches on a quarterly basis, and those fix a number of security vulnerabilities throughout the Oracle products. Those are released in January, April, July, and October. And I'll kind of reference different time periods as we go through the presentation, give you a lot of detail about what's supported, when it's been de-supported, how many bugs have been released over different periods, so you can actually assess the risk in your environment. So let's first talk about a general overview, kind of start at a high level. So what's some of the reasons that people aren't applying the critical patch updates? And there's really three primary ones. The first is IT management, your bosses, are basically not prioritizing. They're not giving you the time, the resources, and money to basically get these patches in. Sometimes it takes a lot of testing effort, things like that. Other times it's the DBAs. The DBAs aren't going to management and saying, well, we need to apply security patches. There's some critical vulnerabilities in our environment and we need to get those patched up. Or maybe IT security isn't really pushing to say, oh, hey, there's security vulnerabilities in the eBusiness Suite, because they're more focused in on the network, servers, and things like that. The second main reason is that you're on an unsupported version. Oracle really pushes their customers to stay on a minimum baseline, especially now with 11i being in extended support, to say you have to be on this version, and the CPUs only support very rigorous levels, and right now the most recent versions of 11i. And we'll actually talk about that in detail and kind of show you some of the examples of when support changed. The third reason, maybe you actually dropped Oracle support. Oracle support is fairly costly, and if you're not getting the benefit from Oracle, why pay 20 to 23% of your initial purchase price every single year to Oracle if you're not getting that money? Other Oracle customers have moved away from the Oracle support to third-party support providers, companies like Rimney Street, that they feel provide a better customer support experience than the Oracle support. So if you've dropped Oracle support and not have it through Oracle, you're not getting critical patch updates, and you won't in the future. So those are the main three reasons that we see working with our clients why they're not having applied Oracle critical patch updates on a timely basis. And this may go back just on a short period, maybe a year, or it may go back 10 years. So there's a lot of different scenarios out there about why people aren't applying critical patch updates. But basically everyone, hopefully on this call, because it's the topic of the call, is in the same boat. You are not applying security patches and you want to know what to do about it. So the first thing what we'll talk about is some of the issues and kind of go in a little bit more detail and tell you even if you are applying critical patch updates on 11i, you won't be in the near-term future. So this graph, I was all planning to go back to 2008 very clearly, and I put down 11.5.7 and say, oh yeah, 11.5.7 really isn't that old, right? So there's got to be some CPUs. Okay, what's the date? Well, the date's back in 2004, I think. And so if you even go back to 2008, you're on 11.5.9 is the latest version that was supported for the critical patch updates. So Oracle wants you to upgrade, constantly be on the latest version. It makes life easier for them, dramatically reduce the support costs, because if everyone's on the same version, they don't have 100 different versions running out there that they actually have to support. So they're using the CPUs as a stick here to get customers to move forward and do constant upgrades. Well, customers don't want to do constant upgrades and actually spend a lot of time and effort testing, DBA resources, getting new hardware, all that, just to apply critical patch updates. So there's kind of this tension in the air between the Oracle and their customers. So the call here today is that big white open space there. There's a lot of white open space that basically critical patch updates are coming out, there's security bugs in these versions, and you're not getting patches from Oracle to fix it. So this also is now showing that Oracle's putting in baselines. So in 11.5.10.2, starting in April of 2008, Oracle started requiring the ATG rollup patches. So they first required rollup patch 5 and 6, and then starting in October 2009, it was RUP 6 and 7. In our customer assessments, when we look at why are people stopping applying critical patch updates, we see a huge spike in the October 2009 timeframe because all of a sudden RUP 6 and 7 were required. A lot of customers didn't go to that right away. Then we see another huge spike in January of 2011 because Oracle moved to extended support and they put out a pretty stringent minimum baseline for 11.5.10.2. So unless you're running that, you can't apply the CPUs either. And then we also anticipate another huge spike coming up when sustaining support ends. So Oracle's moved into sustaining support, or actually will in November of this year. Fortunately, there is a reprieve. Sustaining support usually does not include critical patch updates. Well, Oracle has given a one-year reprieve, and so the last CPU for 11i will be October 2014. So anyone on the call today who is applying CPUs on a regular basis, the last CPU for 11i will be October 2014. So unless you upgrade to R12, there is no CPU support after October 2014 CPU. So that's just to be aware of where Oracle's going and kind of some of the issues here, why people aren't applying them, is unless you're on the latest version with minimum baseline, you're probably 2 to 3 years behind on your CPUs. That's the e-business suite. So now let's look at the database. The database is very similar. And there's also the uplift fees. So when you're on extended support, you're paying an additional 10 or 20% on top of your support just to have the privilege of extended support. So when we start looking at different database versions, if you're still on 11i and 9.208, which is fully certified, or 10.105, because a lot of our clients that we run into that are still on 11i, well, they might be on 11.5.9. Well, for 11.5.9, the supported database versions are 9.208 and 10.105. So even if you're on 10.105, the last database security patches you could apply were October 2011. So now you can see why a lot of customers are getting pretty far behind in applying CPU patches, because unless they're constantly upgrading both the application and the database, they're losing CPU support. So if you are on the latest version of 11i, 11.5.10.2 minimum baseline, you can be also running 11GR2. So you're fully supported with the CPUs. But as you can see, there's a lot of scenarios here where you may not be on the latest and greatest version of the database, and extended support has ended for a number of the databases versions. So this is one key reason that we see people falling behind the CPUs and not able to apply them. They just can't really get these application and version upgrades the database in on a timely manner and getting support and time and testing effort. So another thing to think about when you're thinking about the CPUs, well, okay, I haven't applied them, but every single CPU that comes out is there's more and more security bugs being fixed. And so this graph here shows by quarter how many database bugs and eBusiness Suite bugs were actually patched. So the bar graph is showing the actual number of bugs per quarter. The squiggly lines in the upper right are actually showing the severity of the bugs. So there is a ranking of each bug, and so what we did was we picked out the maximum score for the worst bug in the batch and kind of just graphed it out to show you. Well, everything's over a 5. Well, anything over a 5 is pretty much a high-risk vulnerability. So really, even though you may not be applying the CPUs, you might say, well, only one of them is probably critical in that time period. Well, most of them have at least one security bug that's pretty critical. So every CPU is pretty important. In all of the database CPUs, there's been over 30 released. We've only actually found one that would be optional for our clients to install. So that had a very specific set of vulnerabilities that weren't a lot of optional components. And if you weren't running those optional components, you didn't have to apply the CPU. But every single other one has been what we would deem at least one high-risk bug and needed to be applied. So that kind of gives you a little background about the reasons why people aren't applying CPUs and kind of what's in each CPU in terms of security vulnerabilities. And we'll break it out a little bit more. So let's first talk about the database. And let's do a little bit of background first. One of the key things to understand is when you install a database version or you do a database upgrade, there's a CPU included implicitly. So that database version has the latest security fixes. So even if you haven't done anything in terms of applying CPUs, if you just did a recent database upgrade, you actually get a little bit farther along than you were. So if you do upgrade your database to 11.203, that includes the July 2011 CPU. We recommend you also apply the latest CPU patch when you're doing that. There's a lot of reasons people can't be doing database upgrades, but it's at least key to understand that you started at some point with the critical patch updates. If you did do a database upgrade in the last 4 or 5 years, at least you have some CPUs installed. You probably didn't fix a lot of bugs, but at least you moved forward a little bit. And this is one of the areas that we actually catch a lot of our clients in when we're doing security assessments. They say, oh yeah, we applied the latest database upgrade, so we're fine. Well, the database upgrades only have a minimum baseline for the CPU. You should always apply the CPU patches on top of it. But in this case, we're assuming you're not applying them at all. So let's look about where did the CPUs end and kind of what some of the structure of the problem is. Well, Oracle's pretty aggressive, so when a database version is available, it only has CPU patches for somewhere between 12 and 24 months. Just depending on the version where it falls within the major release. So 11.106 was only available for a little over 2 years. Some other versions are a lot shorter. Terminal patch sets tend to stay around a lot longer. So 11.107 will be available for CPU support until July 2015. But as you can see, the window and the number of database versions supported is very low. So unless you're running 11.107, 11.202, 11.203, or 12c, which just came out and is not supported for any eBusiness Suite version yet, there's just a couple of versions you need to be on. So again, unless you're doing the constant upgrades, you don't have the CPU support. So when we talk about what's the risk of the CPU, what's the best way to look at it? And so the way we look at it at Integrigy is we kind of break it into 4 different types of users. You have an unauthenticated user, and this is basically where you're going to get attacked. What's the kind of the risk and the threat? And the first one is an unauthenticated user. So this is somebody on your internal network. I'm assuming you're not connecting your Oracle databases to the internet at all, and you've at least got a firewall protecting your internal network. So anyone on your internal network who can figure out what the IP address, port, and the SID of the database can at least attempt to connect. They may not have a database account, at least they can attempt to connect to the database. The second scenario is a low privileged user. In this case, we're assuming only public permissions. So even this is, I've not assigned anything to the user. They have create session only. But they do have a database account. They can sign onto the database, but they can't access any data or anything else. It's only public privileges. And there's no way to take away public privileges from the user in an Oracle database. The second scenario is more likely. Is I've got a moderately privileged user. They've got some permissions. I may declare them like, let's say, a read-only user. So I've granted them create session, maybe granted read on or select access to a couple tables, but not much more. They may have maybe a create table procedure so they can create some tables in their own schema and things like that. And then the final scenario is a highly privileged user, so somebody with DBA-like privileges. Mostly what we talk about today, we're not really concerned about the DBAs. The DBAs already have full access to your system, so they can take over everything. Does it really matter if they can exploit a security vulnerability? Probably not. In some organizations who have very large databases with lots of different DBAs, it becomes more of an issue, but in most Oracle E-Business Suite environments, there's typically application DBAs who have the apps account, they have the system password, so they can actually do everything they want in the database. So we'll kind of ignore that type of user as part of our analysis here. So we've kind of got these 4 different risks or threats. And so what can those people do? Well, this graph now shows the number of cumulative vulnerabilities per database version. So I kind of picked out 3 major database versions that a lot of 11i customers will be running. The first scenario is 9208. So you're basically stuck on an older version of eBusiness Suite, let's say 11.5.9. Your database is still 9208. And so really the last CPU for 9208 came out in April or in July 2007. So it went on extended support for the October 2007 CPU, so there's no CPUs after that date, or basically during extended support you have to pay the uplift fee, which a lot of customers don't do. So in this case, I'm assuming the customer has not paid the uplift fee and doesn't have access to the critical patch updates. Well, if we go fast forward today, you're still on 9208. There's going to be 223 unpatched security vulnerabilities in your database. So basically every quarter, more and more security vulnerabilities come out, somewhere between 2 and 10. I think the worst quarter was about 16 when I did this analysis. And these are mostly specific to the version. I made some assumptions because at some point Oracle doesn't even tell you if a 9208 database is vulnerable. So I kind of had to make some assumptions when I looked through the critical patch updates. If it was in the lowest supported version, I assumed it was, but if it actually was a bug that just came out in 11G and wasn't in 10G, I actually excluded those. So this is probably pretty accurate. If you want to just play an assumption and say, okay, maybe it's just half of them, but it is probably pretty close, somewhere to 200. I did the same thing for 10.105 and 10.204. Unfortunately for 10.204, there's a lot less vulnerabilities, but those 33 vulnerabilities, there's probably a couple that can take over your entire database pretty easily. So this just kind of gives you an idea of the severity and the number of bugs in the environment. And if you kind of go out to Google and type in Oracle exploit, you'll actually find websites that people collect on how to actually exploit these vulnerabilities. So the information is out there. Anyone who assumes, oh, these are too hard to do anything with, well, there's multiple websites out on the internet. You just type in Oracle exploit, and they list them, categorize them, tell you what CPU they're in, what database versions. They have nice comments in the code and everything. So these are pretty easy to exploit once somebody understands what they need to do. Definitely, any Oracle developer can do it readily. Maybe somebody with all the SQL knowledge can definitely do it too. So now when we talk about the vulnerabilities and now map it to our types of users that we're concerned about, how does it map out? Where is actually the real risk here? So what I did was actually took the 11.202 CPU and went back in time, assuming that you would never applied a CPU patch, and I think there's close to 30 vulnerabilities here. And then I mapped it out to what was the lowest type of access I needed to be able to exploit it. Well, for an unauthenticated users, there was 9 security bugs. 7 of them actually were denial of service vulnerabilities. And a denial of service vulnerability is basically I can shut down the database listener. I can make the database listener crash. The database stays up, but no one can connect to the database. So I really can't steal any data. I can't do anything bad in the environment. But I can shut down the listener, cause the DBAs a lot of fun headaches. There was one other vulnerability, which is actually very specific to the 11G environment. So unless you're running 11G, it's not really an issue in your environment. So really think about the unauthenticated user. There's not a lot of risk here. There's a little bit of risk that somebody can shut some stuff down, cause some mischief in my environment, but not really steal any data. The real risk for almost all Oracle Critical Patch updates is there is at least one CPU bug per quarter that requires only public privileges. So any user who can connect to the database can actually take over the entire database, steal any data, crash the database. They can basically do anything they want. They can gain DBA-like privileges, and there's at least one bug per CPU on average. Why is this so bad in the Oracle E-Business Suite environment? Well, there's the AppSysPub account. So Oracle E-Business Suite 11i comes with a database account called AppSysPub. The password is pub. So anybody who can connect to your database knows the IP address, the port number, and the SID, and knows it's E-Business Suite. Anyone on your internal network can connect, go do a Google search, and basically find an exploit code and basically take over your database. It's that easy. This is not a complicated thing to do. If you kind of go to our youtube.com/Integrigy, we actually have some Oracle database webinars that we've recorded on there that actually show you, and we'll actually we demonstrate out some of these vulnerabilities and show how easy it is to connect to the database and basically exploit the vulnerability by just, after doing a Google search, grab the code and exploit it in the database. The third scenario is moderately privileged users. So there were 6 in this scenario, and mostly you need to create procedure privilege. And then finally, there was actually a number of vulnerabilities that were only for highly privileged users. And the reason Oracle fixes the highly privileged user vulnerabilities is because there's a lot of scenarios in large databases where DBAs are segregated. So there may be a DBA that has access and is only supposed to manage one part of the database, not actually access data in other parts. And so they can actually exploit things like database vault and break out a database vault and break out of the limited DBA privileges that they have. They might be able to, should be able to do just backups, but they can actually access all the data. That's why Oracle fixes those. In most 11i environments, that's not an issue. The issue is these lowly privileged users that if I can connect to your database, I can take over the entire database. That's the risk, and that's the risk you really need to address. And if you reduce that risk, you dramatically improve the security. And to the point, if you can hopefully eliminate that, applying critical patches on a regular basis isn't as meaningful. So basically, what's the solution? What can I do to basically prevent those people from taking over the database? And as I said, if I can't connect to the database, I can't exploit these critical patch update vulnerabilities. So that's very important that basically I need a database connection of some sort. I need to be able to get to that IP address, port, and SID name to be able to do something bad. Even the unauthenticated user, if I block access to my data center and someone can't access the database, it's very hard for them to do anything. Other things is trying to prevent these lowly privileged users from connecting. You should be using named-only accounts for access. Try to get away from the generic accounts. I can't tell you how many apps reads accounts we see, and then the password is just shared or the password is apps read. So they think, oh, it's apps read. We've kind of locked it down so it can't access social security numbers and credit card numbers, but it can access a lot of data. Oh, by the way, all those app read accounts can actually take over the entire database if you're not applying Oracle critical patch updates on a regular basis. So it's very important to basically know who's connecting, not have those shared generic accounts that are kind of flying to the wind that have 30, 40 people accessing it and you have no idea actually who's using it. Another one is change the AppSysPub account. Again, I'm trying to limit who can actually sign on to my database because that's the risk. If someone can sign on, they can take it over because I'm not applying the critical patch updates. So I've got all these unpatched security vulnerabilities, and so I need to limit access. So changing the AppSysPub password is not for the faint of heart. So it's pretty easy to do in R12. In 11i, it's much more complicated. If you're running things like ADI, it will break ADI, and so you need to spend a little bit of time, but you've got this serious problem that anyone who can connect to the database can take it over, and you're just AppSysPub/pub away from having someone do that. Another area is looking for default passwords on all the database accounts. When you install Oracle E-Business Suite, you've got 250 database accounts installed. Well, any one of those with a default password, someone can basically just kind of know where the database is and try a bunch of combinations and hopefully find an account to get in. That's the number one way when Integrigy is actually involved in data breaches and intrusions. What did someone do? They scanned the internal network, found Oracle databases, and they just tried a bunch of default accounts, and they got in. And that's basically the scenario, and that's what the key scenario here you're trying to prevent is how do I prevent that type of access? The third scenario is the moderately privileged user. Well, the key here is to actually limit the privileges in production. So if people should be able to have more privileges in test and development environments, but in my 11i production environment, I should be very cautious about what I'm granting out. People should not be allowed to create tables, create procedures in a production environment. The more I can limit anyone accessing the database, I'm not reducing the scope because those people can still use public permissions, but at least I know who they are. I've granted them a named account, and now I'm not granting them things like create procedure, which is a very easy way to exploit a lot of different security vulnerabilities. So at least I make it a little bit more difficult. And finally, for the highly privileged users, well, the key is there's Oracle Database Vault. There's external auditing solutions like Imperva and Guardium. Limiting OS access to just DBAs. I shouldn't have developers going in at the OS level because there's a lot of different exploits at that level. But the key here is if I limit direct database access, I reduce the risk dramatically. Then I try to limit it who's connecting, so I know who's connecting to the database, because you can't exploit any security vulnerabilities if you don't have a database account. It's very difficult, and the ones that don't require a database account are basically very trivial. They're just denial of service, so I'm not going to lose any data. I'm not going to get really hurt by that. I might have some downtime, but that's about it. So the biggest thing is limiting database access. So I'm not going to go through the other ones in detail. Those seem to be mostly self-explanatory, but really limiting database access is one of the most challenging things to do in a large application environment. When you're running eBusiness Suite, there's a lot going on. I've got users connecting through application servers. I've got DBAs connecting to manage the environment. I've got ADI potentially. I've got ad hoc users. I've got tools potentially like Discover. I've got probably a massive amount of interfaces and other connections pulling data to and from the Oracle eBusiness Suite. So how do I actually go through and limit that access and actually still have an environment that runs? The first goal we always want to say is at least block the data center. At least know who's connecting in through the data center. I might have 100,000 people on my internal network. 100,000 people don't need access to my database. And what's going to happen is someone's going to compromise my network. They're going to put malware on a secretary's machine and then start scanning the network. That's how most real intrusions happen. Somebody just gains a foothold into the internal network and then starts looking for things to exploit. So the first thing I can do is at least block direct access by blocking the data center. Not everybody on my internal network should be accessing port 1521 on the database. Other ways to actually manage that is use VPN solutions. So I know some people have to access the database, so my DBAs have to access the databases. And so the most two common solutions there are using a VPN, so people will VPN into the data center. If they need access, they've got a special tool that then they have a specific authorization to actually access the servers in the data center. Or you can actually use a jump server, so you use a Citrix or a Windows terminal server. So if I need to do direct access, I actually have to sign on to the terminal server and do it from there, and that's at least a protected environment. Another way to do it, which is a little bit more complicated, is using SQLnet valid node checking. This is by a feature actually enabled in the Oracle database, Oracle eBusiness Suite environment. So you actually just list what IP addresses connect to the database. This becomes pretty difficult to manage. Some organizations can do it pretty well. I say just block access to the data center and you actually eliminate a lot of the issues, and then somebody actually has to be within the data center network, and I don't have to then create specific rules for all my interfaces and all the other servers that connect to eBusiness Suite. Another solution that comes with the Oracle database is Oracle Connection Manager. This is kind of a SQLnet proxy server, so you actually can have a little bit more control than the SQLnet valid node checking, and you can do ranges and things like that. You can do some wildcards within the IP addresses. It gives you a little bit more granular control about who can connect to the database. But you still actually have to specify out in great detail what IP addresses can connect. And then finally, another solution is Oracle Database Vault. Again, it's a very expensive add-on product, but it actually has even more granular rules. So you can say who can connect. You can actually say who can connect at what time and things like that. So that's actually a pretty good solution. It is an add-on security product that is pretty pricey from Oracle, but works very well. But kind of the goal here is if I can block access to the database, and in some environments that we work with our clients, that they've blocked access so well that basically the only people that can sign on to the database are the applications and the DBAs. And when we talk about risk, especially with their management, the risk is low enough that they don't feel as necessary or compelled to apply critical patch updates on a really frequent basis. The risk is you can't exploit them. If you can't connect, you can't exploit them. It's that simple. There's a couple of possibilities that you can actually do it through a web tier attack that I can go through SQL injection. But now that requires a blended thread. I need to find a security vulnerability in another area of the application, then be able to execute something at the database level. But I've already got apps access, so that's not as much of a critical issue. Again, the biggest risk is going to be someone directly connecting to the database, especially with the Apple Pub account and the password being pub, and just doing a Google search and exploiting it. If I can block that access, I've dramatically reduced my risk. So that's for the database. And so again, the critical patch updates need that database access to exploit. And so if you can block that access, you dramatically reduce the risk. On the eBusiness Suite, there's some different issues here. The eBusiness Suite is more of an application. It's a little bit of multi-tiered, different ways to access it. So we'll kind of go through that. So just like we did with the database, though, you might already have some CPUs applied, but for the eBusiness Suite 11i, you go pretty far back. So again, when you do an application upgrade, you automatically get a critical patch update. So when you're kind of looking at this, well, if you've gone to 11.5.10 CU2, you've got July 2005 installed. That's pretty far back. If you're on 11.5.9, that version came out before any CPUs were actually available, so there are no base CPUs there. So for everyone on the call that's on 11.5.9, you are really far behind on security patches. So you just have to be aware of that and try to take the necessary steps to hopefully mitigate that risk. So as we go through, and let's go through a few scenarios here. So if we're on 11.5.9 and we go through and count up all the vulnerabilities since July 2008, there's 107 security vulnerabilities in the eBusiness Suite. If we do the same thing for 11.5.10, you've got RUP 6 applied, but when RUP 6 came out, actually if you're on RUP 5 and haven't applied RUP 6 yet, starting in January 2010, you couldn't apply CPUs. You've got 76 vulnerabilities. Similar scenario, if you've got the minimum baseline but haven't applied any CPUs since, you've got 54 open security bugs. And so now let's kind of do the same analysis we did for the database and kind of walk through how can I quantify my risk. And when we look at the eBusiness Suite, we look at it two ways, externally and internally. External is if you're running an I module. So if you've got iSupplier, iStore, iSupport, iRecruitment, and there's a bunch more. If you're running on the internet, that's a very different risk profile than if you're running internally. If you're running on the internet, you've got 1 billion people potentially attacking you. If you're on your internal network, you've got the size of your internal network and a very good hacker who can get into your internal network, not some script kid who's sitting out in Hungary and wants to do something for the weekend and wants to hack in and steal some credit card numbers. If you're externally, that's a definite risk. If you're internal, that's a less of a risk. So when we kind of look at an eBusiness Suite environment, we kind of say, okay, if you're running iSupplier or anything on the internet, it's a very different risk profile. And then authenticated and unauthenticated users are very important when we're now talking about a web application. So what can I access if I don't have any login credentials? And you can do a lot more than at the database level. At the eBusiness Suite level, I can actually access a lot of different URLs. Remember, this is a massive application, and there's 40,000 plus web pages. All I need is one vulnerability and one web page because they all run as the apps user. So anything I find that's bad in the application, it runs as apps. All your data can be accessed by apps. So even if you're running iSupplier, if I find a security vulnerability in eBusiness Suite and iSupplier, it's running as apps. I can steal all your HR data. I can steal all your social security numbers. It's very doable and it's very easy. It's kind of those are the scenarios that we show when we do demonstrations about, okay, yep, here's a SQL injection bug in iSupplier, you're running on the internet, and I just grabbed all your social security numbers and I downloaded 20,000 records, and I've got all your internal information. And that's worth about $50 each to me. So if you've got 1,000 records in your employee, in your PRL people F table, that includes social security number, name, address, date of birth, and probably a bank account number I can get also. That's worth about $50. So if you got 1,000 people, that's worth about $50,000 in the black market, and that's readily saleable. So you can always quantify how much data you actually have in the e-business suite. If you've got credit card numbers, they're worth $1 or $2 each, but full identity is worth about 50. So when we kind of talk about accessing this, these are the scenarios, internal and external, then authenticated or unauthenticated. So now if we take the same risk mapping, take 11.5.10.2, and say, okay, what are the number of security bugs that have come out in the last, I think this is 10 quarters, we break it out. So for an unauthenticated external user, there's 21 security bugs that can be exploited in one of the I modules. 17 to 21 are high risk. That means I can readily steal data or execute things as the app's user. If I'm authenticated, well, so I had to be able to sign on to the application. For an external user in one of the I modules, there's about 6. 3 need any valid session. So one of the things about authenticated users, if you're running iStore and you browse anything in iStore, you get the guest account. So you actually become authenticated with the guest account. And so you actually have a valid e-business suite session and you're running as the guest user if you're doing things in iStore or recruitment and you haven't signed in yet. You've got still the guest user, and actually security vulnerabilities can still be exploited at a session level just because you've got a guest account. Then there's a number, there's like 27 in this case, that were actually really only internally attackable. So we're assuming there wasn't an I module involved, that it was maybe in General Ledger or one of the other modules that you would typically not run externally. But again, it's kind of there's a lot of different problems and risks in the external modules. So what's the solution here? For the database, it was really limited access to the database. You really can't do that as well at the application tier. You have to access the application, so you actually have to put it in a different set of defenses. The first is if you're running externally, Oracle's got a very detailed DMZ setup, and the first part is actually enabling the URL firewall. So I should give you the MetaLink note documents here in a second, but Oracle comes with 40,000 web pages. If you're running iSupplier, you need to run about 4 web pages in total, not 40,000. And the URL firewall blocks all those. Another solution is, at Integrigy, we actually wrote, before Oracle came up with their solution, we wrote our own solution called AppDefend. AppDefend works as a web application firewall and protects eBusiness Suite from a lot of these vulnerabilities. So when actually any critical patch update comes out, we analyze it, we figure out exactly where it is, and we actually put a rule in to block that one specifically. Another thing for authenticated users, when you're running externally, there's a way to actually block what responsibilities can be accessed externally. That's part of the DMZ setup. And so instead of opening up yourself wide open, so even like the system administrator can access externally, they should be able to force these through a VPN, and you're only allowing a few limited responsibilities externally, like the iStore responsibilities, like the iSupplier responsibilities. Working with internal users, again, our product AppDefend will work both externally and internally. We open up the rules a little bit more internally to allow many more modules to be accessed. Turn down the rules because we also look at things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting. Another way, that number 5, is limit access to privileged responsibilities too. The less I can access, the less I can exploit it. But the key is you need another layer of defense here, and implementing Oracle's DMZ recommendations is number 1, and then trying to put some external layer. We don't know of any other way to do this. There's commercial web application firewalls, but those don't have rules for eBusiness Suite. You have to go rule by rule and vulnerability by vulnerability and say, okay, let's block this vulnerability from happening. And the only way we know of doing that is actually using a product like AppDefend to actually have a rule specific to each critical patch vulnerability that's released and say, okay, if this is attempted to be accessed, this page, this parameter, make sure that it's within the context of what's supposed to be happening, otherwise try to block it. Make sure it's not a SQL injection attack or something like that. So one of the key things is if you are running externally is you need to go follow through on the Oracle DMZ configuration very closely. And there's 2 steps to it. There's actually using the URL firewall, and 2 is actually limiting the external responsibilities. And the DMZ documents detail that in great detail. And basically what's happening is when you install Oracle eBusiness Suite 11i, you've got 250 modules. You've got 40,000 web pages running. And what you're trying to do is say, okay, if I'm running iSupplier, I should only be allowing a very limited set of web pages that can be accessed. And that's what the DMZ configuration does, is it limits that access down to just a few web pages that need to be accessed. And it does two things. One is URL firewall, and then it does node trust level that says, okay, only these responsibilities can be accessed. Again, everything's running as the apps user, so any vulnerabilities in any web page can actually run as the apps account, which means they can take over the database, they can view any data. So it's very powerful security vulnerabilities, and as we saw, most of the security vulnerabilities are actually in these external pages. So if we go back to the list of security bugs, there's 21 security bugs when we did risk mapping here. 17 were high risk. So there's a lot of risk here, a lot of security vulnerabilities that can be accessed in those I modules. Internally, it's not as great, but the external one is really your biggest risk, and then you have to look at, okay, let's look externally, make sure that's locked down, and then look at internally. And our solution is basically, that we wrote specifically to address this problem, is basically our AppDefend product that is an application firewall. It sits and attempts both known attacks, so it goes through each CPU and says, okay, this CPU, we need a rule for that bug, but then it also tries to prevent a lot of known security attacks against web applications. And then we also limit the web modules. So we go through and say, okay, if you're running iSupplier, you should only be running iSupplier, and we'll block GL and all those other modules from running. So that was the database in eBusiness Suite, and now let's talk about the application server. I left the application server towards the end because there's actually not as many security vulnerabilities. It's an ugly picture, but there's not that many security vulnerabilities that have been released. There were a lot years and years ago. So back in probably the 2000 to 2005 timeframe, there was a lot of security bugs fixed. After 2005, there really haven't been as much. And it's kind of somewhat limited, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. The problem with Oracle eBusiness Suite 11i, the application server is ancient in technology terms. So you're running Oracle Apache, so the web part of the application server is running from Apache. But that version of Apache it's running was released in February 2001. The Java component we're running was released in 1999. To give you an idea how old this is, Oracle desupported the 11i application server version you're running in everything except for EBS in 2005. The Oracle forms and the Oracle reports running are in 806 home. So that's the Oracle 806 database. It's just an Oracle home, and that's basically equates to that database version. 806 is an old. I barely even ever used 806 as the database version. So that's how old some of these components are in the application server. Fortunately, most of the bugs were fixed a long time ago. So as long as you're on a somewhat recent version, probably in the last 6 or 7 years, you're much better than you are. If you're running 11.0, you got a lot of huge problems. If you're running 11.5.1, you got a lot of problems. But if you're on 11.5.7 or above, most of these security bugs have been patched since then, and not a lot has come out. And I can actually now demonstrate, actually I'll show you in a second, all those vulnerabilities. So at the application level, server level, there's a couple areas that you need to think about. One is these known Apache 1.3 vulnerabilities. So you've got an old version of Apache, and there's some known vulnerabilities in that have come out, and I've got a detailed diagram of all those in a second. But then there's some problems with Apache because Apache 1.3 is unsupported by Apache. Apache doesn't even attempt to fix security vulnerabilities in it anymore. So they're now on I think version 2.4. So if a version of security vulnerability is found in a newer version, they don't even go back and attempt to look at if it's in Apache 1.3. So there's always a potential that someone can find a security vulnerability in 2.0, and then some smart person will go back and look in Apache 1.3. And the scenario here is especially risky externally, because what happens is people just scan the internet all day long. Our website, we keep detailed records. We get attacked about 100 times a day on an average day of just people scanning the internet. They're just looking for anything out there, and they can fingerprint your web application server, in this case Apache 1.3, and figure out it's Apache 1.3, and then they'll start attacking it. And they're just looking for places to run servers to distribute spam and things like that. Hey, you're a big company, you've got a trusted IP address, I can run a mail, I can attack your Apache, take over your application server, and now I can start running things I want and actually just send out spam and do other attacks and things like that. So that's the risk for the application server vulnerabilities. It's not as big of a deal at the application level because eBusiness Suite's not that common, but a lot of websites run Apache, and that's what they're going after. And then the other area is unpatched forms and reports vulnerabilities. So this is kind of in the technology stack of the application server. There's only been a limited set, and there's really a low impact to the eBusiness Suite, so we don't really actually address those very often. It's very hard to exploit the forms and reports vulnerabilities, especially compared to all the other vulnerabilities that we're talking about here today. But the Apache 1.3 vulnerabilities, these are real. These are things that will be attacked and pretty readily found just by people scanning the internet. So if we actually go through the application server vulnerabilities since 2007, I kind of detailed them out here. Fortunately, there's been very few. So if we actually go through, the blue boxes here are the patches, and I actually included the patch numbers, and then the red boxes are actually the specific vulnerabilities addressed. So you've got two components. You've got the application server, and then you've got the forms and reports. So Forms and Reports 6i requires patch set 19. I'm hoping everyone here has that installed. You may not have applied these patches for forms and reports, but most of these bugs on the forms and reports are pretty low priority, difficult to exploit, not that meaningful in a business suite environment. Then on the Internet Application Server, there's been a couple of Apache 1.3 bugs over time. They recently fixed some in October 2012. Oracle didn't give the mapping out for the exact CV numbers they did. Oracle in October 2012 for the Apache bugs actually did a pretty good job because they knew their version of Apache wasn't being fixed, so they actually backported from the recent versions of Apache and fixed some of the security bugs that Apache themselves didn't fix. So that's pretty proactive. Here, AppDefend, we've written some rules to block these Apache bugs. Any commercial web application firewall will also block the Apache bugs. So that's kind of the solution here, is to go through and implement a web application firewall. You've kind of got two choices. AppDefend, we include the rules ourselves, or there's actually a number of commercial application firewall vendors, some open source ones like Mod Security. A commercial product would be something like Imperva. For the forms and patches, forms and reports vulnerabilities, really the only solution is to try to limit access to some of the privilege responsibilities. Those seem to be fairly minor. You really can't do that much. You can't really attack the apps account or the database with some of those vulnerabilities. So really worry about the Apache 1.3 vulnerabilities and try to do something about those. And that's kind of reducing your risk pretty dramatically on the web application server side. So that's kind of an overview. So we kind of went through each layer of the technology stack, the database, the application, and the application server, and said, okay, if you're not applying those security patches, what can you do to reduce your risk? And you can't eliminate the risk 100%, but there's things that you can do to dramatically reduce the risk and really say, okay, I'm not applying them, and I know I'm not applying them, but I put some mitigating controls and I've reduced the risk of the exploitation. And now we'll open up some questions. Turn it back to you, Phil.
All right, thank you, Steve. We have a couple of questions here. Let me read them. We are not applying CPUs because our security team has not requested them to be applied. If they don't think the CPUs are important, why should I as a DBA?
So this is always a very good question. One of the things that we've always found is IT security is very concerned with the network, the perimeter, servers. They haven't done a very good job and often not gotten into the database and the application layer. They're not really watching for those security vulnerabilities. They're not understanding the risk of them. And also, the way that they're scored is a lot of these security vulnerabilities, especially on the Oracle database side, if you can take over the Oracle database and access all the data in it, on a scale of 1 to 10 that most security professionals use, that's only a 7. because I can't take over the entire database. I can take over the entire database, but I can't also take over the server. I can't access root on the server. I can take over the database, but not root. If I could take over root, that's a 10. But since I can only take over the database, that's only a 7. So a lot of the security vulnerabilities are actually underreported or underemphasized on how severe risk they are. So even if your IT security team's not addressing these directly, you need to be bringing these up and say, okay, we need to prioritize security patches or look at how we can prevent them from being exploited. And that was kind of the purpose of today's presentation, is to kind of walk through and say, okay, I'm not applying them, but what else can I do to prevent their exploitation?
All right, next question. Should we move to PSUs instead of CPUs, given that EBS 11i is at end of life?
Very good question. We get a lot of CPU and PSU questions. So assuming if you are applying the security patches, the difference between a CPU and a PSU is a CPU is just the security patches, and a PSU is the security patches plus other important database fixes. Most e-business suite environments really only need to apply the CPUs. If you're a large data warehousing environment and always apply one-off patches, probably apply the PSUs. But in most e-business suite environments, we don't see them needing to apply a lot of other database fixes. It's much easier to get a CPU patch in because it's only 4 or 5 security fixes, where if you apply a PSU, typically that's 100 fixes, of which only 4 or 5 might be security related.
All right, next question. Should we, one second here. Should we pay for support just to get CPUs, have no support, or try a third-party support provider?
This is always a difficult one, and really you have to look at your business requirements. If you can apply a lot of the recommendations that we kind of walked through today, limit direct database access, put another layer in. If you spend a little bit of money, because if you drop Oracle support, you're saving some money. If you want to spend a little bit of that money to fix this one big open area, because when you drop support, you may not be dropping a lot of actual benefit, but there is a really tangible benefit in terms of getting the quarterly security fixes. And if you're an organization that somebody is going to go after your data, and that's basically anyone running any major application today. It's amazing when we see attacks, the organization typically never thought they would be attacked. It's like, we don't have anything of value. And then all of a sudden you start looking and saying, oh yeah, we just lost a big contract to a Chinese supplier. You probably do have something sensitive that somebody wants. You just have to figure out who that is and why they would want it, but you probably have something valuable. So if you do save money on your Oracle support contract, you probably need to spend a little bit on security. Some of the recommendations here may cost a little bit of money to implement. And also, if you go to a third-party support provider like Rimney Street, they don't provide you the security fixes, but they'll actually help you with some of the security recommendations and kind of walk down that process. So you do need to spend a little bit of money on security if you do drop support. And that's really a business decision to make. Should you drop support? How much are you getting out of your support today? How much money are you spending on that? Can you duplicate that other places with like a third-party support provider? And then from our perspective, purely here from Integrigy, is how are you addressing the security risk? And you can reduce it. You don't need to necessarily apply all the security patches. Yeah, you're never going to be 100% perfect, but you can overcome a lot of the challenge of those security fixes, but you do have to spend the time and effort and money to be able to do that. And be very diligent about it. This is a lot about diligence to say, okay, yep, this is where people can access them and this is how they can exploit them, and then you can put the proper defenses in place to hopefully prevent that 95, 99% of the time.
One last question, and this person must really like you for some reason, Steve. He says, how truly effective are your recommendations compared to applying the CPUs?
For the database, if you limit direct database access and only the DBAs and the application can access it, I would see no reason to apply the CPUs. They're 99% effective. The only way I could do it is if I have some other method to do it, either maybe through Discover or a SQL injection bug. For the application layer, our product AppDefend, I think, does an excellent job. We put a rule specifically for each critical patch vulnerability, and we basically do what we call virtual patching. So you're not applying the patch, but instead of fixing the code, you're basically saying, okay, this is where the code is broken, and I'll fix it another way. Instead of leaving yourself wide open, if you basically do nothing, you're wide open, and they're very easy to exploit. That's what people don't understand, is how easy they are to exploit. I mean, especially if you're on the internet, how people are just scanning for this stuff all the time. But you can effectively, 95, 99%, there's no 100% guarantee, but you can get a long ways down the road by doing some common sense things, putting some additional layers in to block it with not a lot of cost and not a lot of effort. It takes some, but not a dramatic amount.